Good afternoon, everyone. This is Aaron Sumrall with Pig Brig again with you tonight on the webinar. While we're watching the all of you log in, we're going to kind of cover some housekeeping things. Tonight, we do have a sizable group that's indicated that they want to be a part of this. So may give us a few minutes just to get everybody logged in, and then we'll go ahead and go through the logistics of the webinar and how we're going to go through the navigation tonight. But anyway, you're at the right location if you want to hear about tips and tricks, and we'll answer your questions toward the end of the meeting. So definitely let your buddies know that if you don't see them logging in or anything like that, shoot them a text and remind them they're going to be late and miss part of the party if they're not in a hurry. Still see a few jumping on. Okay, what we'll do just to get everything started and somewhat stay on time is we'll go ahead and start doing some introductions and making sure that y'all know the Pig Brig team. And this is something that we try to do every month that we have one of these events is we'll bring somebody in from the team and put them in front of the camera. And tonight what we're going to do is we got two that's in the background and everything that we do, but they're critically important to the progression of what we're doing with Pig Brig and the support that y'all have at the absolute most important levels. And first one there is Amanda Rawlson. Amanda, give us a paw in the air. And Amanda is responsible for logistics and making sure things run the right way, operations and so forth and so on. And she's the one that whenever we need something to happen quickly, she's our go-to person. So other one that's here too is Margaret Porter. And Margaret is the anchor that holds our outstanding customer service together. She is the customer service manager. And so any customers think that's coming into our lives, folks, this is what we pride ourselves on almost as much as the Pig Brig Trap system itself is the customer service that we have. So that's something that they'll be helping out tonight as we go through the presentation to keep up. But Brooke is always with us every month, and Brooke is in our marketing team. So Brooke, we'll start moving in kind of the specifics on the presentation tonight. And one of the things that we want to do is make sure that you know the tools that you have at your disposal there to be able to communicate with us. We do keep the microphones turned off. That way we can cut out background noises and things like that so we can concentrate. But what we want to do is make sure that we answer the questions that you have as we get to the end of this presentation. So if you'll look in that toolbar, when we start looking at that toolbar, depending on your device, it may be at the top or at the bottom, but look for that Q&A or that chat box. And when we look at that Q&A and chat box in there, what we want you to do is we start out every webinar with a question for you just to make sure that as you answer it, one, it's going to tell us some information that we need to know. But number two, it tells us that you understand the technologies and that we're able to communicate with you at that appropriate time. So if you would in that Q&A or chat box there, the question that I have tonight, we need you to put a number in that answer is how many webinars have you attended or how many webinars have you listened to the recording of? So combine those two, and then we want you to include tonight's webinar. So if tonight's the first time, your answer is just going to be a simple number one. But if you've been a normal participant on there, whether it's in person or in listening to the recording, include all of them. And us know I see a bunch of keep up with where your answers stop and where your questions start. So when we get to the end of the presentation, where your questions start is where we're going to start answering questions toward that end. So again, just tell us in that answer, how many webinars have you attended or listened to the recording of, including tonight's webinar? So with that, we'll go ahead and y'all keep answering the questions, and I'm going to start pushing our way through this presentation. And again, too, definitely ask questions. If something comes to mind after the event tonight and you have a question, definitely pick that phone up and call us, because I promise you it's either going to go into Margaret or one of her team members that's going to hit that call first, and they may be able to handle that quickly, or it may be one of those that has something to do with the biology situation or something, and they can get that to me pretty quick. So anyway, with that, we're going to move forward. One of the things that we're coming to the end of, and you'll see there at the upcoming webinars, we're getting pretty short on that list. So when we start thinking about getting short on that list, we look at those previous webinars and some of those topics that we've had. The thing that we want to draw your attention to on those previous webinars is all of those topics are recorded. So all of those presentations are recorded to include the question and answer sessions at the end. So if you missed the presentation and you see something on the list that strikes your curiosity, definitely go pull that webinar recording off the Pig Brig site and give it a listen and give us a holler if there's anything that we need to clear up. With next month, we will have one that's something that's quickly becoming an emerging issue around the world, is concerns surrounding diseases in wild pigs. That's going to be a good one, and I think that's going to be something that you definitely want to tune in for. One, to kind of understand that dynamic of diseases in wild pigs, but also two, to understand some of the myths that are out there that we may need to clear up instead of causing extreme concerns in areas that it may not be quite justified as much as what one may think. So anyway, we'll round out the year with some considerations about genetics, and that might be more along the line of phenotypic characteristics and things like that. So some of those other that'll be myths in there as well. And then again, we'll wrap up the programming year with that April program on life stages and myths surrounding some of those life stages. So with that in mind, what we'll do, we'll go ahead and go into this one. Tonight, we're going to talk primarily on seasonal trap management and we think in this terms of tips and tricks and things you may want to think about as you're moving through that year, and making sure that your removal efficiencies are where they need to be regardless of that season, where sometimes those seasons can give you some frustrations and make you think some probably interesting thoughts. But one of the things that we need to always keep in mind, regardless of where you're at in the United States or around the world, we always need to keep in mind those conditions dictate the quality of the nutrition. Remember, is new when it's wild pigs. So if the nutrition is not there, then a lot of things happen that are either positive for removal or negative for removal. Is utmost importance whenever we think about management strategies and how we adapt to those strategies. There will be some variability amongst in the United States, and where I'm at in Texas, we've had a really dismal fall mass production out of our oak trees. But whenever we jump over into the Mississippi, Alabama area, there may have been just an unbelievable mass production there. So recommendations can vary based on the seasonality and what that nutritional availability is in that given area. Other thing in there is breeding happens, folks. Whenever that breeding seasons roll around, or the gestational seasons, anywhere in that breeding process, pigs are going to perform differently. They're going to have different things on their mind. Their bodies are going to demand different things, and that's going to influence some of your trapping successes, or some of the things you need to put into consideration to make sure that those traps stay highly efficient for you. And then also the human pressure influences success. So what we do whenever we think about pig management is we want to be out there enough to make sure that we know what the pigs are doing, where they're at, what's going on. But again, too, we need to remember that pigs are highly responsive to human pressure. They don't know that we're not out there to just check on things. They may think that anytime they smell or hear human activity, that's a bad thing and a red flag, and they disappear on you. And consistent or persistent pressure will cause those animals to really get trap shy, get weary, and be a little bit more difficult to maintain or to manage throughout that process. So a couple of things to think about. We need to think about it, the fact that pigs don't sweat. So we need to keep water in mind. We need to make sure that depending on time of year, those pigs have to be closer to water than other times of the year, depending on what the food source is and how much of a water holding capacity that food source may have. If it's a highly nutritious green vegetation in the spring of the year, then there's probably plenty of water in that vegetation to allow those animals to forage further away from an established water source. So the other thing we need to think about is, what are the dynamics, the sounder dynamics telling you? Are those sounders completely composed of adult females and younger animals, whether that be a subadult males or piglets or whatever the case may be? That might very well indicate to you that you need to think about some food choices or some trap locations, and the absence of dominant boars in that sounder can tell you really quickly that it's not a breeding season, and plan accordingly. So whenever we do see wild or dominant boars in a sounder, we need to kind of think about, okay, who's the boss in that sounder? Well, I can promise you that if you see a dominant boar in a sounder of a lot of females, he's not the boss. Okay. He's there for one purpose and one purpose only. And quite frankly, his mind is not working, because that's a breeding reason that he's there. And that's the only reason that's driving his boat right there, is the propagation or the continuance of that species. So anyway, he's going to be there for a little while, then he's going to be gone. All right. So then we need to think about the next thing is, do we see pigs during daylight hours? This is a question that I get asked quite often. And the thing that I need to know about, as far as if we're seeing pigs in daylight hours, that's going to tell me about how much human activity is in that area. If we never see pigs in daylight hours, it could very well correlate to a high human pressure on those pigs, and they've gone solely nocturnal. Okay. If they've gone solely nocturnal, that could also indicate that you may have pigs that are a little bit more wary, or a little bit more elevated in their awareness of their surroundings, making them a little bit more difficult to trap. So if you're seeing pigs in daylight hours, it's a good indication that they're probably more receptive to trapping efforts. They're more receptive to responding to conditioning those pigs to those trap locations and so forth. So whenever you get those pictures, whenever you get those observations, don't just go out there and say, well, I had 10 black ones, 2 red ones, and a white one in there. What does that tell you? Other things that we need to know about in that sounder dynamics is the size of those pigs in that sounder. And what I mean by that, if you have a lot of little pigs, little bitty ones that are still absolutely on that sow, that are still nursing, we need to think about the predator-prey relationship with regard to those little bitty pigs. And much like what we see in the African Serengeti, while a lot of those prey species, they have their young on the move. Those young have to get to their feet and move quickly, because if they don't get to their feet and move quickly, those predators are going to make a meal out of them. Well, one thing about wild pigs is everything likes to eat bacon bits. So those little piglets out there are on the menu for bobcats and coyotes, things of that nature. So that female is going to keep those smaller pigs moving more consistently to keep those predators at bay. Once those piglets get up bigger, they're closer to weaning age and whatnot, they're going to slow down. They're going to stay in a given area for a longer period of time, and may stay there completely until the resources are depleted. The next thing that we need to think about whenever we think about sounder dynamics is, if there are no small pigs in that group, in that sounder, we need to look at those females that are in that sounder. Can you tell if they're, just by the appearance of that pig, is she in a gestational phase in that breeding cycle? If she is in a gestational phase of that breeding cycle, we need to keep that in mind, because the closer pigs get to giving birth, the tighter that range is, the tighter that circle is that they occupy, because they're honing in on where they're actually going to give birth to those piglets. So whenever you start seeing sounder sizes change, and this comes up in question quite often, is I had a sounder of 15, and now there's only 9 in that sounder, and I know it's the same one because I can identify the remaining pigs. Well, the question is going to be, is, are those those pigs that are removed from that sounder, were they in a later stage of gestation that they may have removed themselves to have their litters? Also, another question is, obviously, what are your neighbors doing? Could your neighbors have caught some of those pigs, removed them from the landscape? But knowing a little bit more about the dynamics of that sounder is going to help you make a lot of better choices moving forward on what you can do with your trapping. Now we'll get into the spring of the year. Spring of the year, in my opinion, in my experiences, has been the toughest season for trapping. Okay, whenever we get into that spring of the year, those sounders coming out of winter, they've been nutritionally stressed. A lot of those females were able to get into breeding condition in the fall. Then they're starting to have their pigs in late winter, early spring. So the nutritional demand on those sows and on those growing piglets and whatnot is extremely high. Well, whenever we see that green up in the spring, that new green growth in the spring of the year is going to be super highly nutritious. It's going to have what they're looking for to increase the quality of the milk, and thus increasing the survivorship of those pigs on the side of that sow. So whenever you have traditionally been feeding that old corn for your base bait, you go-to bait and all that, that's about 9% protein, digestibility is questionable, and so forth and so on. They have basically eaten a Lunchable all year long, and now they're ready for a steak. So that whenever you see those pigs disappear from trap sites in the spring of the year, you may not be doing anything wrong. It's just a rapid increase in the high quality nutrition. So that's going to be something that's going to cause some tough things for you to consider. The other thing that's out there too, that what we'll see is in the agriculture planting seasons. I know along the Gulf Coast, right now, a lot of our guys that are planting corn, they're getting ready to plant corn the week after of Valentine's. And a lot of what we see in there is the sounder size is changing, because right now, yeah, we haven't made it to spring. They're going to start planting in the spring of the year. But what we see in late winter is we see those sounders, those individual family groups start to tolerate one another in that late winter phase as they start to congregate in those areas where they know that the plantings are about to occur. In the spring of the year, whenever we have a plentiful amount of nutrition, they break back up into their smaller family groups and they go about their different way, and they're less tolerant of competing sounders. So whenever that comes about and those things happen, don't be concerned if your catches get smaller, because those family groups could have quite likely broken up into smaller groups. They also too have got just an abundance of food. So some of those things to kind of keep in mind as you moving forward. The last couple of things in mind when we think about conditioning or spring of the year, it is tough conditioning because of that available food. So the thing that comes to mind when we think about conditioning in those tough times of the year is obviously food is not a concern or a limiting factor anymore. So what we need to think about in the spring of the year is usually what is more benefit or more plentiful in the spring of the year than some other times of the year. The first thing comes to my mind is there's going to be a lot more bugs. We got a lot more mosquitoes out there, with the ticks maybe coming out, things of that nature. One of the things that you'll see is that those pigs they're pretty prolific about their rubbing behaviors and whatnot to try to keep those external parasites at bay. So whenever we have a plentiful amount of food that's out there on the landscape, we need to think about how we condition those animals. And it may be that we're not using a traditional food-based bait, that in that situation, what we may think about is we introduce them an opportunity to remove those external parasites. And the way that we can do that is by using rugs or rubs or something of that nature, where I use a rub in my situations is I'll take a fence post and I'll wrap it with a carpet, and I'll pour fish grease or fry grease on it or something of that nature, and I'll anchor it to the ground inside my Pig Brig Trap system. And they're not coming necessarily to the food, but they're coming to that ability to rub on that oil to keep those external parasites off of them. Sometimes people will use burnt motor oil. As long as we can keep the burnt motor oil on that rug or on that rub, then that's fine. A couple of things that we need to keep in mind with using burnt motor oil is, one, when you get that oil in the soil, it sticks there for quite a while. So you're going to have some considerations there to weigh out with regard to soil contaminations and things like that. The next thing in my mind is a little bit bigger than the initial, and that's that we have had some research findings that's indicated that using burnt motor oil has found that residue of that burnt motor oil into the muscle tissue of those pigs. What that means is they rub on that burnt motor oil and it makes its way through the skin into the meat tissue. So some of y'all that use wild pigs as an opportunity to put something on a barbecue pit, you need to keep that in mind whenever you start thinking about using burnt motor oil. Whereas if you're using fish grease or fry grease or seafood grease or anything like that, no harm, no foul. You're almost basting that animal before you put him on the pit. So it's just something to think about that's outside of that box, that if food is plentiful, we need to think of something else that's going to attract those animals to your trap site to where you can stay effective. Now, this is one of those things that maybe even more so a better decision in your situation than actually using oils or rubs or things like that is seasonal maintenance. At some point of the year, you really need to step back and take a look at your Pig Brig Trap system and say, okay, I may have neglected the maintenance side of this thing during the wintertime whenever I was really stacking pigs up. I need to check on the maintenance of this trap system now while the trapping is less effective. Maybe give those pigs a break, a step away from them, let them get back into a pattern, drop their their awareness of their surroundings just a little bit, and make sure that you make that trap maintenance is taken care of. And then think about where the pigs are going to move later in the year. That's something that's big for me. We know that we said earlier that pigs are super responsive to water and the availability of that water. Is think about it in the summertime. Where are those pigs going to be able to find water sources should it become a droughty type condition and so forth? And in that situation, what I would do in the spring of the year, when that ground's a little softer, if you're going to be using T-post to construct that Pig Brig Trap system, is while that trap's a little softer, get into that area where you know you're going to be trapping at in the summertime. Go ahead and get those posts in place. Take your measuring strap out there, get those poles and those posts in place. When this comes up to one of those tips and tricks that we want to think about in the spring of the year, if you're going to put posts in place, is the use of sham nets. And what we think about with the use of a sham net, it's going to be basically a fake net or something that resembles a fake net. And it's the same equivalent of using an effigy of an owl in your pecan orchards to keep your crows off your pecans. It's something that's not real, but it's going to simulate what you want it to represent. So what we do whenever we have fake sham nets, a lot of people will use shade screen and looks almost identical to a pig brig, and they'll wrap that shade screen around those posts and simulate that pig brig and let pigs get used to going under that net. Shade screens are going to be relatively expensive when we're with regard to some of your other available options for sham nets. Whenever I use a sham net in the area, I'm going to use just simple black trash bags. With those black plastic trash bags, I'll zip tie to 4 or 5 of the T-posts that's in that circumference and let those pigs get accustomed to feeding around those trash bags as the wind is blowing them around and it's popping them around and so forth. Now it's kind of difficult in most places to find trash bags that aren't scented in some way. And for me, I found that some of those scented bags are actually better in the long run because those pigs, while they're getting acclimated to those sham nets or those sham bags, then they also can get acclimated to strange smells in the area that's going to actually cause them to be less spooky, to be less reserved whenever it comes time to actually hang in that pig brig in that trap location. This is something I'll do if I've got one pig brig, but I've got 3 trap locations. I keep sham nets in all 3 trap locations, and then I move my pig brig to wherever the pigs are the most abundant or where they're visiting the most frequently. And I still leave those bags attached to those posts, and I just attach those pig brigs to the post or in the trees. If I'm using a tree set, I'll put those trash bags or those sham nets in those limbs and branches of those trees and let those pigs get accustomed to hearing it, smelling it, and they see the sights while they're getting that free meal in that conditioning phase. But think about some of this stuff in the spring of the year. Other things to think about while I've got this on the spring considerations is the what we call it is the drive rod trick. Some of these tricks that we're talking about are already on the Pig Brig website. Go to pigbrig.com/support, and a lot of these instructional videos are already there in place for you to go take a peek at. And specifically the one we're talking about with regard to the drive rod trick. The drive rod is what we use to put those soft and hard ground anchors in the ground with. It's also the rod that we use in the center to mark the circumference of that pig brig trap with those posts. So take that drive rod. If you have pigs that are reluctant, they may have plenty of food and they're a little bit more reluctant to push under that net. Take that drive rod and prop the skirt up with the T part of the drive rod on the skirt itself, holding that skirt up. Whenever those reluctant pigs do see that opening and they push through that opening, they basically lift the net up off of that drive rod. The drive rod falls to the side out of the way, and the pigs are already in the trap. That helps really well with trap shy pigs, with cautious pigs, those dominant boars, those big boars that have seen every trick in the book. You give them a little bit of an avenue to walk through and they do it immediately. We did this trick in Argentina back in October and put one of the biggest pigs I've ever caught in the trap in the first night that we did that. Without that drive rod trick, he was not reluctant. He was too reluctant to push in on his own, but giving him that little bitty hole, not much bigger than a basketball, and he was extremely willing to put his greater than 400-pound mass through that little hole, and we had a big pig the next morning. So we're moving into the summertime. And remember that water is the key in the summertime. We need to make sure that we remember to trap downslope of the water. And the reason we want to trap downslope of the water is that if those pigs stay in those traps and make mud holes and things of that nature, they are probably shedding out diseases in there, and there's going to be a concern there that in runoff rainfall, what is the runoff going to do with putting that excrement into your water sources downhill? If you're watering livestock in a pond downhill of that, what have we introduced into those livestock watering systems? So also remember too, just the fact that we've already said this, is pigs don't sweat. So they're going to have to find a way in the summertime to regulate that their heat and to stay cool. So they're not going to venture extremely far distances from a water source where they can keep that temperature cool. And so make sure that's one of the first things that you keep in mind. Other things that we want to think about there is that it can be difficult to condition in specific reasons, because agriculture production is in full swing in the summertime. If you're around an agriculture production area, you may want to use some of those alternative baiting options that we talked about in the spring of the year and continue them through your summer months to keep pigs on traps for you. In areas of no conditioning, pigs are super easy, willing to come typically in the summertime, because that nutritional quality that we've seen in spring growth has diminished itself to very low quality, very hard to chew, very hard to digest food sources that have dried out in that summer heat. So it's a lot easier for them to condition those pigs in the summertime if you're away from those agriculture crops. Sometimes we need to think about in those summertime heat situations, we may want to use a fermented bait over a dry corn bait or something of that nature. That with that fermented bait being a higher moisture content, and the reason for that is they're going to need saliva, they're going to need water to be able to chew and to digest that food. If there's not enough water that's in close proximity to that trap site, they may not be willing to eat those bait selections that are dry. So introducing something that's a little bit more or a little bit wetter of a bait selection, you may see those pigs respond accordingly in the summertime. Other things that we need to think about there and is less concerned in the summertime with observing pigs during the daylight. People will come to us and say, well, I was seeing my pigs in the daylight all fall, all winter long. And now I'm in the summer and I don't see any pigs in the daylight. And that makes perfect sense. You may not have done anything wrong, but what's happening there is in the process of digestion, the pig is creating metabolic heat, and that's increasing the heat in the body of that animal. So if it's already hot, you already can't sweat. You're going to be reluctant to be up and feeding during the daytime whenever it's the hottest, because of that digestive heat. That metabolic heat is going to even increase that body heat of that animal even that much more. So in the summertime of the year, that could be one of those things that if you see that happening, that's no cause for concern. That's perfectly normal. The other thing that we need to think about there is that, and this is not on the bullets, and is something that's also comes to mind with regard to those of you that may be using deer feeders to condition pigs to your trap sites. If you're using deer feeders to condition those pigs, you can get a quick response in the fall, the winter, the spring, more so than you can in the summer, because of that digestive heat. If you have your deer feeder set to condition in the summertime, you don't want to be conditioning those pigs with the deer feeder during daylight hours, because quite likely those pigs aren't going to visit that trap site until literally the middle of the night, from 11 o'clock until 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. So if you're actively using those deer feeders and you have those going off during daylight hours or very shortly thereafter dark, you're giving raccoons and deer and other things a very long period of time that they can visit that trap site, consuming all of your bait before the pigs even have a chance to get there to get to it. So if you're using those deer feeders, make sure that you change the feed time, that it's going to be a lot later at night whenever you expect those pigs to be up and feeding, because that's the coolest time during the 24-hour cycle for them to get out there and feed as much as they can and have that digestive heat dissipated by the time the sun comes up the next morning. Other things that we're going to think about during there is normal increase of human activity. With agriculture production going on, it's quite likely that there's going to be elevated levels of human activity that could also cause those animals to go a little bit more nocturnal for you than what you normally see. Some of the things that we need to think about there in the summer continues is keep shade in mind, and keeping shade in mind is right there, that top bullet. Pigs don't sweat. So if you're catching pigs and they're exposed to the direct sunlight in those summertime heat temperatures, you quickly could get to a trap, or you could get to a trap at 10 a.m. in the morning, and the pigs that you caught that night may be already dead in that trap from heat exposure, sunlight exposure, so forth. So make sure that, for me, whenever I put a trap set up, I'm going to make sure that I know, or I have some kind of a shade source, that if I can't tuck it up into the brush itself, if it's on a fence line or a tree line or something like that where the tree is at, or the trap is at, I want there to be vegetation on the eastern side of the trap. The reason why I want the vegetation on the eastern side of the trap is because it's going to stay in the shade far longer after daylight as that sun starts to rise. So it gives you just a little bit more wiggle room to get there before those pigs are in direct contact or direct line of that sunlight. But that's one of those things that's only in very exceptional situations, because we definitely want you to get to that trap as close to daylight as possible to get those pigs out before they realize it's time to go home. Now, think about using, and we've already talked about using bait with a higher moisture content. Use the brush, get to the traps early, things of that nature. Other things that we need to think about there is in that same capacity is, if we know that in the summertime pigs are going to be more prone to wallowing than they would be in other times of the year, we need to keep our ground, our type of ground in mind with regard to trap site locations. If we have sandy ground, or if we have ground that has a high silt content, those pigs can be laying on the skirt of that pig brig and kind of wallow out a hole in the ground. And whenever they wallow that hole out, it still holds that shape when the pigs get up and move. And whenever that happens, where they've wallowed out that hole and it holds that shape when the pigs get up and move, there may be an opening under that skirt, and those pigs may exploit that opening under that skirt, go under that skirt, and leave on you. If that happens, if you have sandy ground or a high silt content in the ground where your pig brig is at, we may want to do something else out there that we have a video on. It's using what we call the rebar trick. So whenever you start looking at your pig brig trap site for videos that'll help you out, look up the one that's on the rebar trick. In those sandy environments or in those silty environments, if you have a pig that goes under the net on you, what we do is we'll take a rod of rebar anywhere from 36 inches to 42 inches long, and we'll drive it in at that same 45-degree angle as the anchor stakes in the center of that trap. But what we'll do is we'll drive that rebar in about 3 mesh back into the skirt itself. What happens is, if it's the same angle of those anchor stakes, it'll allow those pigs to go in. Now, we drive that rebar into the ground where we only have about 4 to 6 inches of that rebar exposed above ground. So we're going to be 3 mesh back into the skirt of the trap. That rod is going to be driven in at that 45-degree angle, just like your anchor stakes, but then it's only going to be out of the ground 4 to 6 inches. And what happens is those pigs push into that net. The net still functions exactly like the way the net is supposed to function. But whenever that net falls back into place, it falls back over the top of that rebar, and it locks that mesh, or it locks that skirt to the ground, just like what the anchor stakes do at those locations. They can't root under that nearly as likely, and you'll have those pigs that think they figured that pig brig out. You can throw them a curve real quick and catch those pigs that try to go under the skirt on you. We already talked about in that hard ground. We're going to drive post in the spring. Okay, if we're trapping in the summer, you don't want to drive post in the summer. Or let's back that up, drive them in the spring of the year. Also, things to keep in mind: if you're on a deer lease or something of that nature, drive those posts earlier in the season before you start working on food plots or deer stands in the fall of the year. That way you're not whipping on T-posts whenever you're hoping to not spook your deer. So get those T-posts driven, locate your trees if you're going to use tree sets far before seasons ever even start. That way you can sneak into an area, move in there, get your pig brig hung, and get back out of there without the sound of driving T-post or any of those noises that may cause concern for your deer. But again, in the summertime, if you don't have time to drive those posts in the spring of the year, use the trees. We've got some videos there on that Pig Brig site that are excellent instructional videos that show you how to set tree sets up. And quite frankly, once you've done a tree set once or twice, they become so much faster and easier, actually, in my opinion, to use than the T-post, because the tree set takes you about, I don't know, 20 minutes to set up, just because you can remove the need to drive those T-posts. Just some ideas to keep in mind as you're moving forward. Fall of the year. Get into the fall of the year, and this can be similar to spring in difficulty. The reason why we're looking at fall difficulties is because of new high quality food availability. The fall of the year, we've got your mass production, your oak trees, your pecans, some of those other mass producers that may be soft mass producers, like your persimmons and your plums and things like that. That mass production is becoming mature at that time of the year. Other things that are new to the environment are your wildlife feeders. Usually, one of the rules of thumb around the United States is if you have the ability to put up deer feeders, they typically find their way to the landscape somewhere around Labor Day weekend, for those hunters that are getting ready for deer season later in the fall. That wildlife feeders are going to add tons and tons of new food to the landscape, causing those pigs to have more than enough. Other things that we'll see in the fall of the year, we see that picture of that corn there on the right hand side. Agriculture crops become mature, and now we're going to have harvest of those agriculture crops, which results in a lot of grain spillage on the landscape, and pigs are the first one to take advantage of that grain spillage. Other things that are out there too, in the summertime, we typically see that decreased rainfall, the harder ground, the less water, the less moisture that's out there. Fall of the year, we start seeing those rainfall amounts and frequencies ramp up. When we see those rainfall frequencies and amounts ramp up, that comes about with soil saturation. When we get soil saturation, all of those invertebrates, like your bugs, your beetles, your worms, your grubs, things like that are deeper in the soil profile, have no choice but to get closer to the surface of the ground, or they'll drown. Whenever that wet ground is a situation early on in the fall, then that's going to be just an unbelievable amount of invertebrates just below the soil. Those pigs are going to exploit those as long as they're available, because as the soil dries out, those invertebrates go right back down to where they're not accessible to those pigs. So, and then your mature seed availabilities of a ton of other things that are out there, that could cause for some challenges during that fall season. Other things that we need to think about is use secluded trap sites. Whenever we talked about the wildlife feeders being new to the landscape, we need to remember that if there's a wildlife feeder that's new to the landscape, the only reason it's there is because of increased human activity. Okay, so whenever we see they're using secluded trap sites, we need to think about where high human traffic areas have been. Is that going to be at your food plot locations? Is that going to be at your deer feeder locations? Could that be just a simple fact of going out there and checking fences or whatnot in the fall of the year? But don't put your trap locations in proximity to high human traffic areas. That's just going to cause those animals to be more sensitive to what's going on in those areas, and be more reluctant to go into those trap sites. So as we continue with fall, we need to keep non-targets in mind. And specifically, we need to keep deer and bear. We'll talk bear first, because if you're in the area where bears hibernate, if it's not in the deep South and you're in that Arkansas area, maybe northern Louisiana, Tennessee, Kentucky, things like that, where you have bears and pigs overlap, the bears just get absolutely ravenous in the fall of the year, trying to put on as many pounds as they can. So whenever we think about bears, we need to keep in mind the time of year, the food availabilities. Whereas if you're in your Pig Brig Trap locations, check out your bear deterrents that we are working on right now in the field. We'll have those videos out for you pretty quickly with regard to bear deterrents and what we're seeing some high success rates on with excluding bears from Pig Brig Trap site and not pushing the pigs away at the same time. Some very promising information and data to come out of that on that regarding bears. Now with the deer, when we think about deer in the fall of the year, we need to kind of consider the males of the species. The consideration there is that now in the fall of the year, we have antlered bucks. All right. So when we start thinking about antlered bucks and keeping non-targets in mind, is that we need to think about our human activity at that trap site. We need to think about whenever we bait that trap at that trap site, that we want to make sure that there's no bait in the skirt of that Pig Brig Trap system, because if that trap is in the set mode and there's bait in the skirting of that Pig Brig Trap system, the deer feeding patterns is going to be a head that's sweeping while it picks up that bait. So if that deer is pushing underneath that skirt and at the same time picking up bait, you're going to increase the chances of that deer getting antlers hung up in that skirt of that net. So what we want to do, especially in the fall of the year, if you don't do it any other time of the year, this definitely needs to happen in the fall and the winter when you have antlered bucks, is to make sure that there is no bait within 18 inches to the skirt of your Pig Brig Trap system. You want to make sure that the bait is in the center of that trap. That way, if anything does push underneath that net, they've already committed to that net before they or committed to that bait before they actually encounter that bait. So even if it is a deer that pushes into that net, they've already committed to it. A deer gets inside that net, they get ready to leave, and they can jump that 5-foot sidewall pretty easily. But we don't want to give them the opportunity in that feeding behavior to get their antlers hung up. That's going to be critically important, keeping that bait out of that skirt. The next thing that's critically important in that deer concerns or deer decision tree is we don't want to gradually lower that net. That's not something that we want to promote anyway, regardless of the time of the year. We don't want to gradually lower that net, because if we've got that net in the conditioning mode where that net's 15, 18, 20 inches off the ground to condition those pigs, if they're deer in the area that are also using that Pig Brig Trap site, they're going to condition just like the pigs are to going under that net. If you gradually lower that net to get closer and closer to the ground to the time of set, one of the things that you're going to do is those deer are going to be just like those pigs. No matter how far off the ground that net is, the deer are still going to actually try to go under it whenever they can easily go over the top. You've conditioned them to go under, they're going to continue to go under. So whenever we're conditioning pigs and deer are concerned, we want to go all the way from the conditioning height to the set height, all in one motion. No gradual lowering of that skirt to that set mode. So something that you keep in mind, again, too, if you're using deer feeders in the fall of the year to condition a Pig Brig Trap site, it's going to be difficult to keep the corn where you want it to be and not getting it into the skirt. So a couple of things you need to do in the fall of the year with regard to deer feeders in your traps is, one, you can turn the RPMs down on your feeder motor to where it only drops that corn in a very limited area in the confines of that trap. The other thing that we want to do, many of you have varmint guards on your deer feeders. Just simply wrap a sack around that varmint guard, or it could be a cloth. It could be as simple as a shirt that you have in your truck. A lot of times what I'll use on wrapping a deer feeder varmint guard is screen mesh material that you'd find in the screens of your windows or a screen door, something like that causes that bait to fall directly into the floor of that trap. Now we need to think about moving forward. Family sounders are going to start to congregate again beginning in the later part of the fall. Later part of the fall is when we start to see a lot of this mass production being picked up. Some of those deer feeders have been removed off the landscape, and those female-led sounders are going to start getting closer to those agriculture fields again. Whenever there's plenty of food available, sounders will tolerate one another and not be quite as competitive. So you may start seeing in the fall of the year sounder sizes increasing pretty quickly, and that's because there is plenty of food and they start to tolerate one another in areas that are more prone to having high abundances of food. Agriculture harvest, depending on the crop or depending on where you're at, that may still be going on later in the fall of the year, especially whenever you start going into those areas that may be in the very extremes of where pigs are occupying, into that southern Ohio area where they're still trying to get corn out of the fields earlier into November. Alternative baiting still may be an option that we need to keep in mind. Okay, we need to watch the natural food availability. If there is an overabundance of natural food availability, we may want to give those pigs a break for just a little while and let them consume as much of that natural food availability rather than trying to catch those pigs at a difficult time of the year. Because if we do anything wrong when there's plenty of food availability there, the pigs are going to remember that site and they're going to be harder to catch whenever that food availability is decreased. So sometimes you just need to call parlay and back away from those pigs and then come back at them at a more opportune time of the year. So Moving on into the winter time, winter part of the year. That is definitely the most productive season of the year for trapping. We have a decreased food availability. We have hungry pigs, whether it's a boar that's trying to recover from being from breeding all fall, to a sow that's in a gestational phase in her breeding cycle. That in that whole process of moving through, and her body needs during that gestational cycle, they're going to be easy to catch. They're going to respond quickly. The remaining, and then you need to remain patient whenever we're conditioning, always throughout the year. For me, the most important phase in the trapping process is conditioning. If you get the conditioning wrong, you can miss pigs not catching the full sounder. You can do things that will cause those pigs that you may not even catch anything if you get the conditioning part of it wrong. So condition those pigs, being patient. Okay, we need to remember pigs don't carry a watch or a calendar. So don't set your traps according to what the calendar says. You need to set those traps according to when the pigs say that they're ready to go. And that's going to be whenever we try to get 100% of that sounder using the inside part of that trap actively. We need to think about alternative baiting options here as well. It could be that those boars are still out there actively pursuing receptive females, where we can use some odors and things like that, some pheromones that will cause some of those animals to be more willing to come to a trap location. So remain patient. The one thing that we haven't talked about as far as the baiting process, regardless of the time of the season, is whenever I bait a Pig Brig Trap system for the first time during that conditioning phase, about 90% of the bait is on the outside of that trap, where only 10% or so I put within the confines of that Pig Brig Trap system. And the reason I do this, and it's regardless of the technology that you're using, is I want to introduce those pigs to that trap site and not try to force them into an area that they may be shy of with a big piece of equipment that's new to that landscape. So we want to make sure that we keep those traps conditioned to introduce those pigs to that location. As soon as they eat that 10% of the bait on the inside of that trap, then we move 100% of the baiting into that trap. We give them no more opportunity to consume bait on the outside of that trap once they have started to consume that first 10%. Who knows how long that's going to take? You're just going to have to watch those pigs. If they're active during the daytime, they're probably ready to be trapped. If you don't see those pigs until night, if it's any other time of the year than summertime, it may be that they're trap shy and that they're responding to pressure. So keep those things in mind as you're moving forward. A couple of things that we're going to talk about here as we start wrapping up the content part of this. One, we can't say it enough. You stay patient. We get people call all the time and they're like, what do I need to do? That I had pigs on bait, I had pigs coming, and then all of a sudden pigs just disappeared. What kind of remedy do I need to throw at them? What kind of potion do I need to throw at them to get those pigs back on bait or back at my trap site? Before we start throwing the kitchen sink at those pigs, we need to find out, first of all, why they left that trap site, why they went off bait. It could be just as simple as your neighbor started shooting at pigs on an adjacent fence line and it scared them out of the area. It could also be that we start seeing mass production falling in the fall of the year. If they, I've seen it before happen quite often, that we have pecans and acorns that are ready in the fall of the year. We get a little tropical system that comes through there. The wind gets up to 35 or 40 miles an hour. And now we have an abundance of food on the ground. And of course, they're going to stop. It could be agriculture harvest that's going on that they've quit. So before we start throwing everything at those pigs to get them to come back, we need to find out why they left in the first place. And make sure you keep your activity in mind. What we need to think about whenever we bait traps or when we visit trap sites, you need to do it with consistency. If you're consistent in your behavior, in your activity, those pigs will habituate to your activity. So if you bait your trap every time, the same time, every day, then as you leave that trap site, those pigs are going to hear that activity moving away, and it's automatically going to let them know that there's food on the ground. So whenever I bait traps, I do it at the same time every day, usually within an hour of dark. And I keep the truck engine running. I keep the four-wheeler engine running. I keep the radio playing. I keep things as normal or as consistent as I can, because those pigs can hear me at that trap site. I don't shoot at them. I don't make any unnecessary movements. And then whenever I leave, as they hear that engine moving off into the distance, that's going to be a signal to them that there's food on the ground, and they'll be there relatively quickly. And that decreases the time that other non-target species are going to be able to get to that trap. Keep in mind what the pigs are telling you. Let those cameras talk to you. Let those cameras and those pigs tell you what's active and what's going on there. The last thing I'm going to say, and this is something that's come to mind as we've been going through this, it's not on a bullet point, that whenever I was working with Texas A&M, we were looking at some things that trappers were telling us, and it was the answer is obvious, and I've seen it my whole life, is that people would say, well, I go out and I trap every night of the month, but I only catch pigs on the first 4 or 5 nights. And when you step back and you think about it, that makes perfect sense. Because if you only catch pigs in the first 4 or 5 nights of the month, whatever you haven't caught in that first 4 or 5 nights, you've educated them. So whenever we start looking at research wise, then about 97, 98% of those pigs you're going to catch within the first 5 nights of a trapping effort. From the time you catch that first pig, don't try to trap those pigs, but about 4 more nights before you back off. What's going to happen is the longer you push those pigs, the harder they're going to be able to catch later. So after about night 5 of catching pigs, I'm going to raise my Pig Brig Trap system back up into the conditioning mode, and I'm going to put 1 more baiting inside the confines of that trap. The reason I do that is whatever stragglers that I did not catch, whenever they come back to that Pig Brig Trap site, the last memory they have of that trap site is a free meal. What that's going to do for you is when you come back to trap that location again, the conditioning period that may took you a week in the first trapping, it may only take you 2 days in the second trapping, because their memory is positive. They got a free meal and they're ready to come back in and go to work. So that shortens your obligation at that trap site during that trap process by being consistent and thinking about it. A lot of ways we treat it like a boxing match. Okay, that's why they have 12 3-minute rounds in a boxing match, is because if you had one 36-minute round, the boxers are going to be inefficient after about 3 minutes. So what we do, the same thing with pigs. We hit them quickly. We back away from them before they get wise to what we've done. We give them a free meal, and in 2 weeks or so, 3 weeks, 4 weeks later, we come back and we hit them again at the same location. It keeps them off balance and it keeps them from educating. So anyway, that's some of the things that we wanted to cover with you tonight. I know it kind of went a little bit longer than what we try to do. We want to try to keep you back to your lives as soon as possible. But one of the things we want to do as we wrap things up again, these are the upcoming webinars that's there. The ones that are in there in the previous webinars, we have those recorded, and those recordings are there for your review anytime you need them. There's a lot of information in there that may be pertinent at certain times of the year, depending on where you're at or what your situation is. So those recordings are there to hopefully help you moving forward. We do have the 3 that are coming up, and I think these 3 are really going to be home runs and for a lot of people. So definitely remember to join in with us at the same bat time and the same bat place next month. What we'll do next month is it's going to be on February the 23rd. Again, the 4th Thursday of the month. We try to keep it on 4 Thursdays of the month, with the exception, obviously, of Thanksgiving. And then this year, Christmas fell on that, where we tried to bump that again. So 10 months out of the year, we try to keep them on the 4th Thursday, 7 o'clock in the evening. Pass the information along to your friends and your buddies. And with that, I think we have got questions and answers, or questions that's going to come up. So I'm going to call on Margaret and Amanda to try to help me navigate through there, because I definitely see a lot of questions and answers, or questions, I think, in the chat. And we'll keep answering questions as long as you want to stay on here to answer questions, or until we start to get into a lull, and then we'll return you back to your lives, and you can go on and enjoy the rest of your evening and think about what you need to do with regard to the next steps you need to do with your pig removal process. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to the questions. And ladies, what do we got?
Okay, Aaron, we've got some questions here. One of the first ones is, I've been baiting my traps with corn. What are your thoughts with baiting cold peanuts?
Okay, that's an excellent thought. That the first thing that's going to come to my mind is that in some parts of the country, people have tried to use peanuts that are not typically grown in that area. if there's a commodity that's not typically grown in that area, pigs may not respond to peanuts at all. If it's common to your area and pigs are accustomed to eating peanuts, sometimes what I do is, depending on the cost of that commodity, is corn going to be cheaper or is peanuts going to be cheaper? If the peanuts are cheaper, then yeah, if they're used to eating them, I'd use peanuts. The other thing that comes to mind, if corn is cheaper, then what I would do is go to the grocery store and get peanut oil off the grocery store shelf, and you pour the peanut oil over the top of the corn. It still smells like peanuts. It's going to be that curiosity that's going to draw them in. For me, a bigger concern is going to be, rather than the bait that you're using, is whatever bait you start with in that trapping process, stay with the bait the whole way through. And that doesn't matter if it's corn, if it's peanuts, or if it's some unbelievable concoction that's 3 pages long. Whatever it is that you start the process with, stay with it, because it's just like a restaurant. If they change cooks, you know it. Okay. And sometimes if they change recipes, if they change cooks, that may be all it takes to remove pigs off that location, because it's not the pattern that you've set. But excellent question. The same thing happens sometimes where we're at with soybeans. Is corn may not be working, but they may go to soybeans. So yeah, definitely check out a few different options. And if they're used to that food source, no problems using it. But whatever you start with, stay with it throughout that process.
Okay, Aaron, thank you. The next one is from Hank Forrester. He said, I caught my first 10 pigs a couple of weeks ago. I'm not seeing any pigs come near the trap after that catch, but have seen about 15 additional pigs while deer hunting on different areas of the 400-acre property. I imagine the scent of dung and blood is deterring the pigs. Is this typical? Should I typically plan to move the trap to a different corral after a catch?
Well, and Hank, it's good to hear from you. Anytime you wanted to holler at me, definitely do so. But one of the things is that if you caught those pigs out of that area, if it was a dominant sounder in that area, there may not have been any overlapping sounders that were in that close proximity of that trap site. So one of the things is definitely keep that trap in the conditioning mode, keep bait in there, but you don't have to keep the bait super fresh. Just keep an eye on it, keep monitoring it. The one thing about it is blood, not so much of an issue. But we do see that there is some aversion whenever there gets to be a lot of feces in that trap site, that pigs are, I mean, this is a strange comment to say, but it's true. Pigs are relatively a clean species. They do not like to eat where they defecate. So if you've had pigs in there for a long period of time, there's a lot of defecation in there, a lot of feces, a lot of dung, then it may help to scoop some of that stuff out. Other things to keep in mind, Hank, and I know what property you're talking about there, is that you may want to locate you a couple of other places around that property and either locate a tree set or keep some posts up. And then whenever you catch in a given area, move that trap to a new location and put sham nets that we talked about tonight on that existing location, and keep watching that location and just bounce that net back and forth into different areas. As simple as it is to move that net, you can occupy a couple of 3 different areas pretty easily with the same net. And keeping your foot on there. But if you're not seeing pigs at that location, that just means you did an outstanding job and you removed everything that was visiting that trap. So hold your pattern, because obviously those pigs in those adjacent areas are going to realize that basically the Joneses moved out. Now there's an open house there and we're going to move in. So it's just a matter of time of how long is it going to take before those adjacent sounders occupy that area again. So feces may be an issue, somewhat, not typically. The blood's going to give you too much of a problem. But yeah, give me a holler. Anything like that happens, we can, I'm typically kind of somewhat through your area pretty often.
And that's really helpful. I know we had a comment about the blood and the feces, so I feel like you've addressed that. We also had a mention of pouring diesel fuel over the blood in the trap. And I think you've already spoken to this, but if you want to just elaborate.
Yeah, we'll hit that again, because actually I did not talk about that tonight. And one of the things that what we need to first and foremost think about with regard to diesel is that every other option that comes to your mind regarding diesel, other options are better. I mean, that diesel is not an option in my book. And there's several reasons. Number one reason is there's far better options. Okay. The other thing that comes to mind in there is, one, the blood's not really going to cause you any trouble. The other thing that's coming to mind whenever we think about diesel is that it's a soil contaminant. So whenever we think about soil contaminants, one of the things that we pride ourselves on with Pig Brig is that we're in it for the environmental health. We're in it for making sure that we don't have undue taxes on the landscape. So, and diesel does present that. It is a point source pollution issue. The other concerns about, or things to think about with regard to diesel, is people use it a lot of time as a deterrent for non-target species. The thing we need to keep in mind with diesel is if those species, it doesn't matter if it's pigs, deer, raccoons, or bears, anything like that, if they're hungry, diesel is not going to deter those species either. If they're hungry, they're going to eat whatever's there just to fill their belly. The other thing to keep in mind with regard to pigs and diesel usage at the trap site has to do with their digestive system. Pigs have the exact same digestive system that we do. We have a monogastric system. Pigs have a monogastric system. Okay. So whenever we think about that monogastric system, we need to think about it. And folks, I promise you, if you have a driver's license in your pocket, you probably have used the siphon hose to get some fuel from parents or grandparents or something like that in the past. Okay. So whenever you use that siphon hose and you put a petroleum product into your digestive system, it turns into a lubing agent really quickly. All right. So whenever we think about using diesel at a trap site, pigs may feed on it for a shorter period of time, but whenever they get enough of that petroleum product into their system, it's going to cause them to have a bellyache, just like it does anything else. And you can actually repel pigs with diesel. So that's something to keep in mind. You may get a curiosity visit out of pigs with diesel, but there are tons and tons of better options to use. And I'm very, very glad that they brought this question up, because it is a common conversational piece that there's a lot of belief about diesel that's out there, both good and bad. But we're not going to ever promote the use of diesel at a trap site, just because there's so many other better options that are out there, and we don't want to be contaminating soil. So excellent question. Glad it came up.
Yeah, really appreciate that, Aaron. I'm glad you shared that. I think Bill's got a good point about cold peanuts are free at the local peanut sheds, and they usually have a big pile of them that they've tested and are free to the public. So that's good information. And
yeah, that's excellent information too. Hey, another thing too, if y'all are in places that have rice dryers and things like that where they're milling rice, a lot of times those rice hulls are free. You can come and pick up rice hulls all you want. One of the things that we found out several years ago is that there is some level of aversion to rice, or rice bran, fermented anyway. I mean, rice bran in a dry phase, in a dry form, is like crack to every wildlife species out there. But whenever you ferment that rice bran, rice hulls, things of that nature, raccoons don't really prefer anything to do with a fermented rice product. They don't care for that too much at all. Bears are a little bit more reluctant to use a fermented rice than they are a corn or something like that. But pigs, they don't have a problem. They'll consume rice bran quite often, but it's usually only seasonally available, and in some places it's not available at all. But it's something to kind of keep in mind. But it's excellent information to share with them about the peanut hulls. Or those discards on the peanuts.
Yeah. And while you guys are sharing information like that, I would encourage y'all to, if you are a trap owner, we have a Pig Brig owners group that's on Facebook. And honestly, this is the kind of stuff that is so great to share with everybody and just to ask questions and pass ideas around. So it's a really good spot to do that. And let us know.
Yeah, we're not going to put you in Pig Brig jail either. So I mean, it's a good thing to have.
Yeah. Bill also said that he's got 2 traps and he bought enough T-posts to set up 4 locations on his property. And really, that is, if you have a large area, that's the way to go, so that you don't have to do so much work when you are wanting to switch locations. Aaron, I don't know if you can speak to how far apart would you set up your sites, that kind of thing. And
I think part of that's going to be too, Margaret, what we need to think about when we think about distancing between trap sites is going to be how the property's laid out. What are the resources that are on there? If we've got a travel corridor there that may be along a waterway, like a creek or a river or something like that, then you probably only need one in that location, because those animals are going to flow up that travel corridor. If you've got a agriculture field that you may only have a fence line there with vegetation on, and that's a travel corridor, you may not, you don't need but one along that. Now, if you just have a vast expanse of hardwood or a consistent habitat type, then what I typically do is I don't entertain the idea of having traps any closer than 500 or 600 yards from one another. We got to remember pigs have legs just like fish have tails. So they can find their ways to different trap sites. One of the things that we can even spread those traps further apart with is the use of odors in the air there. And what I'll do if I need to try to attract pigs to a location just out of a curiosity deal is I don't use fermented corn very often, but I always have a 3-pound coffee can of fermented corn in my truck. And what I'll do is I'll use that for a way to attract pigs and use the wind in my favor. So if you got a pig brig that's there and you want to try to draw pigs from a distance, you don't need to worry about fermenting a whole 5-gallon bucket of corn. Take a sponge or a shop towel or something of that nature, and that little 3-pound coffee can of fermented corn, soak that sponge or that shop towel in and hang it on the trap cap or hang it on a post or whatever it is. That way the wind starts working for you and it blows that odor into places that if the bait's on the ground, the wind is never going to have enough action on it to get that odor very far. But you get it 5 foot off the ground at the top of that trap, that odor will travel for extensive distances. Therefore, you don't have to have traps as close together as what you may think.
That is awesome. That's awesome. And I want to say too, if you guys get in a spot where you feel like you need another setup, definitely call in and make sure that, you're getting the right stuff. We have a second set kit that's not going to cost you an arm and a leg, and you end up having the ability to move your trap around a lot easier. Okay. So keep us posted if you need help on that. There is another question. I want to use rebar stakes as alternate ground anchors. How low below the welded in nut do I weld the washer? And do I drive the stake down to the washer, then stop?
Yeah, if you're talking about the outside ground anchors and replacing like the soft ground anchors or the hard ground anchors with the rebar anchors, we actually have a rebar anchor that we have now. It's a T-shape, just almost identical to what the drive rod looks like. And it's just simply a rebar with a T welded on the top of it. And what we do whenever we replace those soft ground anchors with that rebar anchor is, if you look at the cam strap, we got the hook on the end of the cam strap where obviously you have the hook on one side of it and then you have the solid ring on the other that attaches to the strap itself. Take that rebar and run it down through that circle. And whether or not you've got a nut welded on the top of that rebar or it's a T-bar, then we drive that rebar all the way down through the eye of that cam strap to the surface of the ground. The further you have that cam strap attached to that anchor stake above the ground, you're going to have more play, and your pig brig may loosen up on you if you don't drive that anchor all the way to the ground. So with that T-bar welded on the top of that rebar, it makes it a heck of a lot easier just to grab it with your hand, twist it a couple of times, and pull that anchor straight out of the ground. But yeah, we want to make sure that cam strap is as close to the surface of the ground as possible. That's going to minimize the play in that trap itself. So keep that in mind if you're welding on different attachment ways to put the hook itself in there. We want that thing as close to the ground as possible.
Okay, that's helpful. And there's a couple comments about the ground anchors that we do send with the trap, and just that they have a hard time staying in if you've got really wet ground. I don't know if you want to speak to the ground anchors that we have, but we do know that sometimes you're in situations where they don't work as well for everybody. So there are plenty of alternatives that we want you to be aware of, because you may be able to get, T-posts really easily, and you can use that for ground anchors instead,
Right.
and that would do a better job for you. So,
Right.
I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, and that's something that, you hit on it perfectly, Margaret. I mean, that's one of the things that, if you have extremely soft ground, and it could be in agriculture fields that's heavily cultivated and it's loose down deep, it could be a deep sugar sand, or it just could be saturated ground. One thing is make sure that you're driving those soft ground anchors all the way to the loop. Make sure that loop is the only thing that's above ground. And get the maximum holding ability out of that soft ground anchor as you can. Other things, like you said, with using T-posts, we've already talked about the rebars just in the previous question, but if you're using T-post, one of the things to keep in mind is if you have to worry about livestock, keeping cattle away from your Pig Brig Trap system, then what we use is, instead of using those soft ground anchors, we have a couple of videos that are up on the Pig Brig site of different electric fence designs around that Pig Brig that will keep those livestock animals away from your Pig Brig site. One of them is using T-post as your external ground anchor. And that way you orient that T-post to where it's at a 45-degree angle away, facing away from your trap. And we drive that post in the ground. And I just use a 5-foot T-post. And I use a 5-foot T-post and I drive it to the end of the ground to where the top of that T-post is 36 inches above the ground. Okay. Then I attach my electric fence line at the top of that T-post at 36 inches. And I basically kill two birds with one stone. I now have an anchor in the ground to attach my Pig Brig to, plus I've got the structure in place to put the electric fence on. Just remember, if you're putting electric fence up to either keep deer back or to keep livestock back, don't go below 36 inches, because if you do, your mature pigs can reach up and touch that electricity and they will change zip codes on you. All right. So you have to keep it tall enough where those pigs can't touch it. But if you're keeping deer back, you don't want to go too tall where the deer will go under it without even a concern. And typically that window is between 36 and 40 inches is what you want that at. But good question on the T-post there. Yeah, we use T-post as an alternative anchor. We use those rebar as alternative anchors. Some of the things that you may want to be to test it before you try it is, a lot of people say that they like using those screw-in anchors that you can put in and just screw those anchors into the ground, that they typically, you'll see them like on mobile homes and things like that. Sometimes the holding ability is not what you think is, and they'll pull out of the ground with minimal impact on that net. So just make sure that you get whatever's going to be in ground deep enough that you're going to get that stability that you need. And then every time, if you're going to use those other alternative anchors, whenever you go to your trap site, do a walk around on that trap and make sure that trap's still tight.
Aaron, we have another question regarding repelling nuisance animals. What are some other options other than diesel to stop raccoons?
Well, the one thing that's going to be there, it's going to be the most effective for me anyway, is going to be just my activity. If I'm going to go to the trap that morning and check that trap, take pigs out of that trap, I'm not going to bait that trap that morning. I'm going to make a second trip out there to bait that trap. The number one way that I found to remove pigs out of that, or to remove raccoons out of that trap site or that trap location, is to shorten the interval between when you're there and when pigs show up. So what we do, and what I mean by that is, like what we talked about earlier, is I'm going to only bait traps within an hour of dark, and I'm going to be consistent in the time that I bait those traps. Because if I bait consistently, the pigs are going to acclimate to my behavior, just like cattle do. If you're using cubes to cube cattle or to feed cattle, is if you do the same thing every day, those animals are going to come to you when you're there. Okay. And I'm sure that pretty much all of y'all have, if you're on the Facebook owners page, have seen Justin Johnston's post on the Facebook page. Literally, Justin has sent me text while we've been on this webinar that he baited his trap the same time every day. And literally this afternoon, in 35 minutes after he baited the trap, he had pigs in. And that's the consistency that we're talking about, is shortening that interval between the time that you bait the trap and the time that pigs arrive. The next thing that comes to mind whenever we're thinking about actually baiting that trap is, many years now, what I've done, if I have a lot of raccoons in the area, is that I'll dig a hole just with a set of post hole diggers in the center of that trap that may be a couple of feet deep, maybe only the size of a coffee can or something like that. And I'll put my bait in that hole and just cover it with a couple of inches of dirt. What'll happen is those pigs will smell that bait in that hole, and literally looks like a grenade went off in that hole. They will get that bait out. But typically raccoons will only nibble on that bait a little bit at the top, leaving the vast majority of that bait inside that hole for those pigs. Other things that I'll do is we all know that pigs are extremely strong. They're stout animals. If you bait a trap and you've got a ton of problems with raccoons, get a half a sheet of plywood. If you bait your trap, put a half a sheet of plywood over the top of that bait. Those coons cannot pick up a half a sheet of plywood. but a pig will flip that over really, really quickly and be able to get to that corn on the underside of that plywood. We've done this on projects that we've got in Spain where they have problems with other non-target species that they use shell rock there to put shell rock over the top of the bait to allow pigs the only access to that. We just got back from a trip to work with wildlife services in Hawaii, and Randy and I got to see the chance of how bad, and y'all gonna laugh at this, folks, and I did whenever I first heard it. Feral chickens are their main non-target species of concern. The way that we have come up with them working around feral chickens and keeping them back is the same thing. We put a piece of plywood over the top of that bait, those chickens can't access it. But whenever a pig comes in there, they flip that obstruction over, whether it's a rock or a sheet of plywood, half a sheet of plywood, and those pigs have immediate access to that bait. So we are working on some repellents in the field right now, specifically for raccoons. So again, stay tuned. But the one thing that we don't want to do is I'm still not ever going to be the one to recommend the use of diesel to try to keep those coons back, because in time, you're going to keep your pigs back as well. And the time is a lot sooner than later. Good question, though.
Hey, so Aaron, all right, one of the questions, I have a large herd of Aoudad and they dominate the area, and I'm afraid that I'm going to catch one or several in my trap. Any ideas?
Yep, I know exactly what you're talking about. We have a place in the west central side of Texas, not too far north of Uvalde, and we have an issue with aoudad as well. What we did with aoudad and looking at some repellents there is some of the same recommendations that we have for whitetail deer. Is there's product that's out there that you can get that's pretty readily available. It's just emulsified egg solid, basically rotted egg. Its shelf name is Liquid Fence. You can find it under a Safer brand, SAFER brand. And if you use it at a full strength, so you go in, you bait your traps. Whenever your traps are baited, take a pump up sprayer full of full strength emulsified egg solid in water, and top dress that bait over in that trap. And aoudad, axis, whitetail do not like that emulsified egg solid. It does smell like rotten eggs, but pig have no problem there. Your pig activity at your trap site, but aoudad, axis, whitetail do not like that emulsified egg solid. We are honing in more specifically now on the exact amount that what you need, but the full rate strength on the container seems to be working pretty dang well. So we'll keep in touch with you as we refine that and get a much more specific amount and how we do that. But emulsified egg solid right now is the go-to for the aoudad and the other exotics. Any other questions?
I think the questions have slowed down, Aaron. I think that was just about the last one.
Good. Well, I mean, that's good that we've had that many questions. I mean, that's one of those things that you kind of wonder about whether or not that you've stimulated any brain activity. If you don't have any questions, I'm a little concerned. But the questions help us kind of dictate the direction that we need to go with putting more resources together for y'all to make sure that we have what you need to have your questions addressed. But definitely, you call Pig Brig, you're going to talk to one of us. You talk to somebody specifically if you want to talk to somebody specifically, but I promise you the first ones that's going to pick that phone up is going to be Margaret or one of her ladies, and they'll know how to navigate that system and get to where it needs to be. But if you have any questions that come up later down the line, definitely give us a call. Tell them who you want to talk to, and we're not going to farm it out to somebody else. You'll talk to who you want to talk to, get the information that you need. But make sure that if you have any thoughts coming up on topics that we're going to introduce into season 2 for the webinars, year number 2, get those to us quickly. We are literally going to be deciding that calendar within the next week to 10 days. So we need to get your thoughts in quickly. So if you want an input, get it to us fast, or it's going to have to fall into year number 3, or we'll have to have it as an emerging issue somewhere during the system. But other than that, folks, I do sincerely appreciate your time. We try to limit these to typically somewhere around an hour, but the conversation is too good to break it off. So we hope we didn't take too much of your time and you got the information that you needed. But with that, folks, I'm gonna go ahead and sign off myself. we do appreciate you. Pass the word if we can help out anybody. We'll do some programming for you if we need to come to your state or where you're at. And definitely, like Hank, give me a holler when you're going to be around the property. And whenever I come through that part of the world, I'll stop by and visit with you. And anybody else, if you want us to come by and take a look at your situation, then I'm glad to do it. Other than that, have fun, have a good evening. So what do we say? Happy trapping and be safe.
Happy trapping. Thank you guys so much for
Yeah.
joining us.
All right. Y'all have a good night. Be safe.
Yeah.